My name is Mike Atkinson. Again, I work at Amazon, and I write a lot of Python using CLIC. Everything that I present here, I have on GitHub, all the sample code, the presentation as well. Try not to judge the code too harshly. It's to illustrate CLIC and some of the alternatives, but it's otherwise not the most robust code. But if you were here to talk about the 2006 Adam Sandler comedy where he gets a magical remote, that will not be the topic of tonight's conversation, but I hope that using Python CLIC, you feel like you have a magic remote and you have an easy button to create a command line interface. But don't worry, because the code package CLIC has some better reviews, I think, than the movie of the same name. So we're talking about command line, and we're talking about users who are using maybe a command prompt, maybe a terminal. So there's not a lot of clicking in a terminal. So why the name CLIC? It's actually an acronym for Command Line Interface Creation Kit. That's where the name CLIC comes from. If you've written JavaScript and have worked with methods like onClick, there is no relation. So if you see a decorator with the name CLIC, try to separate that in your mind from onClick or different actual user interface, graphical user interfaces that involve clicking with a mouse. But first, why would you use a command line interface instead of a GUI? A couple different reasons. I'll just talk about a couple that are common or that I've heard or that I've experienced. One is you might be running commands in an environment that doesn't have a graphical user interface. So let's say you're on a remote server or virtual server or cloud instance, and you just don't have a GUI installed. Your command line might be your primary interface with that particular machine. In my area, we use a lot for developer tools. We're writing a lot of things for our own internal developers to use to build software or write software, and maybe it's all developers, maybe just the developers that I work with, but they don't like to leave their terminal or they don't like to leave their IDE very often. So if you take them outside of that and say, here's a web interface, they frown at you. So whether they're using something like Vim or something like Visual Studio Code, they like that single place where they don't have to navigate away to do something else. They can just stay right where their code is and execute all the commands that they need. A third possible use case for a command line interface is, let's say you're running some system commands and you need some type of elevated access. Might be a little bit easier especially if you're working with other system utilities or Unix commands. Might be easier to do that using something that's a little bit more terminal native, and you can use input and output redirection, like pipes in Bash, and you can kind of hook all these things together. So if you're writing something where you need some very precise or elevated privileges to a system, command line interface might be an easier route for you. So I'm going to talk about some alternatives to CLIC, and I'll go through some code examples of different things that folks have used, a couple that were mentioned tonight. So basic one, sys.argv. I'm going to hop into my VS Code, and let's try to make that a little bit bigger so you can actually read it. How does that look to folks? All right. So for this example, I wanted to create something that wasn't just a completely arbitrary use case. What I came up with was a command line interface to manage a to-do list. So this is my version that uses the sys.argv, and start down here in my CLI method, which I have all these things hooked into console scripts, so I can just execute them without having to type Python-m. But we're going to build a command line interface using sys.argv. So this is the super basic to-do list manager that we want to build. We want to be able to add items, mark items as done, and list all the items. So the first thing I did here was I created a list that has all of my valid commands. And this is so I have something to reply back to the user in help text if they don't enter a valid command, or if they enter no command at all. So I can execute it like this, and it says, you didn't specify a command, you need to specify one of add, done, or list. So we got some very basic help text there. And the sys.argv will take basically anything that I type after this point. So this particular executable that I'm calling gets saved to the 0 index in sys.argv, which is a list of strings. And anything else that I type there, space separated, is going to get added to another index. So I want my index in this case to be the second thing that I pass. So to do v1 add, for example, that's going to be my index 1. So I take that, I save it as a command. You saw before, if there's an index error, I have this little help message. But then I have to take that command and I have to figure out what to do with it. I have to figure out what did the user specify that they want to do. Did they say add? Did they say done? Did they say list? And in the case that it was none of those, like I do to do v1 foo, I'm just going to print the help text. And I've constructed all this help text by hand. Just a basic string that I'm managing that I'm outputting to the user. So once we have our command, we're going to pass in, or we're actually going to call the method that has the functionality we want. And in the case of add or done, I'm actually taking some arguments. So for add, I'm going to take a string that represents the item that I'm going to add to my to-do list. Or for done, I'm going to take the index of the item that I want to mark as complete. So I'm going to pass those in. Those are going to be after my command here. So I'm going to say like add mow the lawn. So that's going to be in index 2. And you see add and done both take an argument. In the case of list, I actually don't have any arguments for that. But you see we're sort of beginning to construct what our command line is going to look like using sys.argv. So come up to here, as I said, list does not take any arguments. We just go through the file that is storing our to-do list and print out all the items. In the case of done, we're looking for a particular index, so we go through the list, find the index, delete it, rewrite the list, renumber everything. And in the case of add, we create a file or open it in append mode, and we write that item to the file at the end. We're appending to the end of that file. So with this, we have a fairly basic command line interface for our users. But there's some challenges here. For one, we've got not a lot of very sophisticated helper methods or input validation when it comes to what the user is specifying. So we've done a little bit here where we've written our own help text and we've written our own checks that they add a valid command, but we've done all that ourselves. And in the case of some of the variables that we're passing, I mentioned before that this argv is a list of strings. So for example, in the case of the done method, we're actually having to take that index as a string and then cast it into an int so we can actually do something with it. So that's not great. It would be great if we could just use an integer when we want an integer. So thoughts on some of the pros and cons of sys.argv for our command line? Does anyone have any thoughts?
It has a certain simplicity to it. Like if you really are doing like a one-time throwaway script, then maybe it's okay. It's the benefit being it's like all pure standard library, so there's no third-party stuff there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So does this, what you're doing here, does not require argparse?
So what I'm doing in this example does not require argparse at all.
I'm just wondering why not, because when I associated doing this, originally it was you use argparse, I guess maybe because that structures the argparse input line. Is that why you're kind of making it yourself, and so you don't need argparse?
Right, but the example that I'll show immediately after this one, I'm going to rewrite this whole thing using argparse. So we will get to that and talk about some of the benefits that we'll gain.
Am I right
Yeah,
in
please.
saying that if you called it using Python SysRV.py, then it would mess with the whole program because the args would be more included?
In that case, it's a good question. I would need to test it to be sure. I don't think so, because I think all of the arguments to Python would still be at index 0, so I think it would ignore the part where you're specifying the interpreter, but it's a good question.
I asked because I know I've had that problem in the past with one of these
Mm-hmm. All right, so couple things about, it's gonna let me just open this up with, no? Oh, yes, it did. So we didn't have to install any additional packages. This was all standard library type of stuff. The I/O validation, we had to do a lot of that ourselves. If we're writing any complex commands, that's going to be fairly difficult. For example, if we need to have nested subcommands, we're going to have to kind of keep that straight in our heads and build this list, which is sort of one-dimensional in that it's just a flat list of strings, but we're going to have multiple conditional cases that we need to worry about. And everything is manual. We need to write our own help function. We need to write our own parameter checks. We don't get any of that out of the box. So what can we do maybe instead of this? A lot of folks have talked about they've used argparse. So argparse, I've used argparse for years. For a while, it was my go-to. It was only until recently that I have switched a lot of what I'm actively doing from argparse to CLIC. But let's talk about argparse. So I have a version here that uses argparse, and we can kind of compare what we did with sys.argv with what we can do with argparse. I'm going to start actually down in our sort of equivalent of a main function here again. And so we're calling init argparse, and then we're storing our arguments with parser.parseargs. And if we jump up to see what that actually looks like, and I'll close this sidebar, make it a little bit easier to read. We've got our sort of usage string that helps us to have some help text for our users, description of what this program is. We can start to add some arguments, like we can add a version, for example, and print out a version number for our application. And then we can start to add these subparsers to give ourselves a little bit more flexibility with how we structure these things. So, for example, I have a subparser here for the add command, another one for done, and a third one for list. And each one of these can now have its own arguments that are specific to that subparser. So we know that add, for example, takes a string. We're going to call that item, for example. That's a required parameter, and it's the name of the item that you want to add to your to-do list. Done, on the other hand, is going to take an integer, and we're going to call that index. That's the index of the item that you're going to mark as done, or you're going to remove from this list. And then we have list, which again, as before, doesn't take any arguments. So now we've got some better type checking. We've got some help text that's specific to the different commands that we're going to run. And so let's look at what this looks like. So to do v2, so I'm going to call to do v2 with help. And we get this this help text that was, or this sort of light version of a man page that was built partially with things we specified, but the structure was really put together by argparse. So we're offloading some of some of the structure now to argparse, which is definitely a benefit for us. And I can do, for example, to do add help, and now I get some more specific help text for that subcommand. So we're beginning to really build a more robust interface for our users here. The methods themselves, I didn't change really anything about the methods, but now we have, we're doing a bit more input and output validation, so hopefully we have some better assurances that we're going to handle the user's input properly. So argparse is pretty good. We had to install, or not install per se, but we had to import argparse, and we had to construct this argument parser. But we're getting a little bit more control over our command line interface. So what do folks think about this? Folks that have used argparse, what do you like about it? What was the challenge?
Very difficult to use. It was just a mess. It's like, you got to do the arguments, but it's the following stuff after it. You got to do stuff after to use it. It's not just making the lines of the command. You have to do more stuff after it. It's still not clean.
Right. Yeah, one of the challenges that I ran into was understanding these subparsers, and I was building a command interface where I had multiple layers of subcommands, and to have subparsers on top of subparsers, it got a little bit messy. It was definitely took some time for me to understand and go through the Python documentation, try to figure out how to structure these things. So a little bit more of a learning curve. We do get this sort of out-of-the-box help text, and we get this parameter validation. We can use these types, specify types for our arguments to have, I guess, some flavor of type safety. I guess Python's flavor of type safety. We have now required. We can specify required versus optional parameters, so we're getting more flexibility in how we can build our interface. Part of standard library-ish in that we don't need to install a module to make this happen. But, oops, go back. The syntax is sometimes a little bit challenging to read, or certainly to remember. I've had to go back into old code and reference what I had written to try to figure out how to write some new code. And if you're writing any complex commands, I've had particular trouble with that with argparse, in that the moment you get to more than like one level of nesting, it can really be a challenge. So we're here to talk about Click, and I'm here to maybe convince you that Click is a little bit easier to use than argparse. There are alternatives. You mentioned Typer, for example. So Click is just one of the tools out there, but it's one that that I've liked to use, one that has some benefits for me. So I'll actually, before I get into that, I will flip back to our to-do list, and now I'm going to show you an example where I'm using Click to write the same application. And so Click uses decorators pretty extensively. So the first one you notice here is this click.group. So effectively, we're going to group our arguments together. And our main method of actually sort of condensed a little bit, and actually the next example will demonstrate that more completely. But we have this version option, for example, just to make it feature complete with the last one. We can have a specify to do v3 -v or -- version. I guess -- version. There we go. So that's the version according to our setup.py. Put in this debug flag just to sort of illustrate that we can have these different flags where it's not an argument that expects some type of value, but it's rather a flag that we're specifying. So we can do debug and then have some command like add, and perhaps that's going to change our application. In the debug case, for example, we might have some more verbose logging. We have this new concept here of this context object, this click.context. That's going to help to store some of our the context, basically the state of our command line, and that's going to come in a little bit more handy when we start to build very complex things. But for now, I have, for example, this context debug that I set to debug, and that way any of my subcommands are going to be able to inherit that debug command. I only need to define it once up here, and then everything else can inherit that. So our first decorator up here for our CLI function, our function called CLI, was this click.group. So we've defined this group, and we've called our function CLI. Now, from when we start to build out these commands, we're actually going to use the CLI as the beginning of our decorator here. So we're creating a command under the click group that we created called CLI. So this is how we can begin to build out our structure. That's something that can get a little bit confusing when you're first new to Click. I know that took me a little bit to get used to that syntax. But then we can begin to create specific arguments for these commands. So for example, our add command had this argument for item. It was of type string, and the actual logic here is unchanged from before. Our index again had a type of integer for our done function. And then down here we have our list again, which doesn't take any arguments. So we've condensed our code just a little bit, not too significant to illustrate for this very simple application, but we've gotten down about 13 lines of code. And let's see what our interface actually looks like. So do help, for example. And so we get something that's pretty similar to what we got with argparse. A little bit different in where it calls certain things out, but the format is fairly similar. We can see here that we've got these options that are sort of global: version, debug, and help. And then we've got our commands. And just like before, we could do specific command and then help, and we get more detailed information. So this one, for example, takes an item, and our done command takes an index. So we've sort of replaced some of the complex logic of argparse with maybe not more or less complex, but different logic from Click. But what I want to illustrate in this next example is how you can use this to build some much more complex interfaces or much more flexible interfaces than what we've seen so far. So in this example, in our to-do version 4, I've got again this main CLI method. That's our main Click group, and then I've actually abstracted some of my subcommands into their own modules. So I have list commands and I have to-do commands. So I'm actually starting to build out some more capabilities of our to-do list application. Because maybe we don't want to be constrained to just one list. Maybe we want to build out multiple lists. So let's take a look at what this version looks like. Check out the help text for this. So now we've got these, we've got the same kind of structure to our help text here, but we've got some different commands. Let's take a look at what some of those do. So we have list, for example, and we can use this to manage our list, so we can add a list or delete a list. And we've got another subcommand called to do, which is for managing the actual items in that list. And if I look at to do add, for example, we see that we can add an item as before, but we can specify a list that it goes into now. So we can specify this list name, pass in a name. This is the default that it gives us is to-do list A. So we can see that we can start to build out some more complex things. And if we look at the other modules, you can see how we can start to modularize our code, make it a little bit easier to manage or to organize, and also kind of reduce the blast radius of any breaking changes. I know that if I'm looking at a pull request or a code review that someone has sent me and it affects just this one module, it might be a little bit easier for me to read and review. I built some fairly complex interfaces, and this sort of main module has gotten to several hundreds of lines, and figured out that I could use this add command to pull in modules from somewhere else, and that made things a lot easier to organize. One other thing I want to call out, this is actually a little bit of a hack that I'm slightly disappointed does not seem to be something that's available natively with Click. But I've had these cases where I've wanted to reuse arguments across multiple places and didn't have a really good way of doing that. So what I ended up doing or borrowed from someone else who had the idea was to create my own custom decorator and then specify the options that I want to share as a list. So I can have, for example, I might have multiple commands that all use this list name argument, and I can use this decorator here so that I don't have to specify the command and the details and the default value multiple times. I can just use this decorator to inherit that. A little bit disappointed that wasn't something that was natively available, or at least not that I could find, but the workaround works well enough once I figured out how I could do it. So that's a bit of a more complex case of using Click. And so back to kind of why someone might choose to use Click over some of the alternatives. You've got this out-of-the-box input and output validation. You've got this help text. You can handle these complex cases where you've got these multiple nested levels, or you've got complex arguments or parameters that you want to specify. Maybe you have different types. Some things I didn't choose here or show here are you can specify, for example, a choice type argument. So you can say, choose one of these things from a list. And you can also have, it handles prompts fairly easily. So it has a built-in type for prompt. So if you just need like a yes or a no, you don't have to write any of the validation of, check to make sure it's capital Y or lowercase y or capital N. It will do all of that for you. And it's fairly flexible in that you can structure your package however you like. You can define your modules where you want them, and Click will kind of just figure it all out as long as your decorators make sense. But obviously it's an additional dependency, and if you're new to Click, it's going to take you some time to learn the syntax. So pros and cons of adopting a new tool or putting a new tool in your toolbox. Something I want to touch on, but don't have a robust code example for, is you can use Click for unit testing. And I've done this fairly extensively for things that I've built for work. So you can use this CLI runner to basically invoke your CLI with the arguments that you choose. And you can use this with things like PyTest parameterize. And so you can specify a list of different combinations of arguments or different cases. For example, maybe you're doing some file operations, and so you have a file argument. You can specify what happens when the user specifies this, what happens when the file doesn't exist, what happens when they don't pass in this argument at all. So I've found that this works pretty well with PyTest too, and so it's fairly easy to use in unit testing, which is really great. And the two main things that you get out of things that you would commonly use in assertions are, for example, an exit code or reading the output. So I'll assert exit code equals this, or if I'm trying to assert that some error is raised, I'll have a maybe exit code 1, or assert that something was present in the output based on what the user specified. So that's kind of my brief intro to Click. So we'll click off our TV here, but want to sort of end on just an anecdote from something that I've recently inherited that where Click was relevant to that. So I was writing inherited a program that was part of a build script for developers who were writing infrastructure as code. So the iteration of the build script when I inherited it was a developer had to install this script using our own custom internal dependency management system. They had to configure, in this case it was Ruby, so they had to configure their rake file with the specific commands to run this particular check. And they needed to do this for every single package that they wanted to include these tests on. And that's where we lost a lot of users, it was difficult to install this thing. They had to do a lot of dependency management, figured out conflicting versions inside of their packages. So didn't have great adoption for our tool based on that alone. And then even if you got past all of that, we were finding that the actual output that we were specifying to users, or the flexibility of what we were building, was not really great. So we found that it was, at least in the community of developers who you're writing tools for, it's very easy, and probably true of everyone, not just developers, but it's very easy to lose that trust or to lose that interest. And once someone hits a roadblock with the tool that you're trying to get them to use, they stop using it, they move on to something else, they forget about it. And in what we were doing, we were trying to build a new standard, but there was no one was mandated to use this. It was more like, we needed to prove that this was valuable, that someone was going to take the time to look at the application that we were building. So I inherited this. We said we've got to do something about this. We turned this into a command line interface so that developers could install this once and then use it across dozens or hundreds of packages that they were using. And we saw at least one, if not two, orders of magnitude increase in our users almost immediately. So what I like about Click is that it makes it easy for developers to build interfaces and to build those things with the checks in place and to gracefully handle those failure cases where someone doesn't specify a command correctly, or they specify something that's invalid for one reason or another. And if it's easy for you as a developer to make that interface, I find that you're more likely to really be able to meet the needs of your end user. In using things like argparse, I'd started going down this road with argparse. Things got very complicated very quickly, and so I was sort of less incentivized to build out a command line that people like to use. It was more just like, let's get something working that's minimally viable and call it good enough. But using tools like Click, it's a lot easier to do some of those things. I'm able to offload a lot of the minutia of the interface to the Click package, and that means that I get to focus on the things that matter, the actual functions of the application, not worrying about the I/O or exactly how it's structured, just making it into a valid structure. That's all kind of handled out of the box for you. So that's my sort of intro to Click. I'm curious of the people who've used Click or people who've used argparse, what they think, what sort of got you into using Click or using something else for writing CLIs, and what do you like and dislike about it?
So, I mean, I started using Click in part because I really like the decorator syntax. I've used Flask and Fast API for web services quite a bit, and it was a very easy transition from like a Flask app to exposing those same things on the command line. I also think it's a pretty opinionated package, which for somebody who doesn't live on the command line all that much, helped me write command line interfaces that were a little more familiar to people who kind of lived and breathed new command line tools.
I originally was writing the argparse stuff for doing training modules, scikit-learn training and writing inference and prediction inference, where you can just specify what model you want to do inference on, this data set is, run that model, and so on. And that's, so I was doing minimally viable code to just get it to work. I guess the challenge I see with Click is I'm new to decorators, and so it was interesting that you're doing it with the decorators. I'm trying to start using decorators. You put multiple layers of them in there, and so now it's like, okay, I didn't know this was so much, with the decorators. I'm sure, I'd like to know, must be making it a lot easier, because I'm just new to the whole decorator concept, and I think there's a Python version, like 3.9, right before you can use decorators, right? Like the earlier Pythons did.
I'm not sure offhand what the minimal version is. I'm using 3.8 here.
Decorators have been around for Python too, so they're a very reliable, stable thing that you can depend on being there.
Then you can't write Click without a decorator, right? Like if you write just a bare yes or no, you have to use a decorator?
I've never seen it used without decorators.
So technically, a decorator is syntactic sugar for calling a function. Like you could rewrite that without the @ signs by having like your CLI function in one thing, and then after you define your CLI function, call click.group and then pass in the CLI function as the argument. That's effectively what a decorator is doing, where it's just kind of taking that wrapping of a function call around something else. So yeah, like Mike was saying, I've never seen anybody do that with a Click application, but I would have to believe it's possible. It would be a pretty different way to use it. That you'd be reading all the documentation, you'd see decorators everywhere, but you could do it.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're writing a function to call a function with a decorator, and I would have originally just written a function to call a function.
Gotcha.
Right.
One of the things I noticed about Click, so I've spent a little bit of time with Typer, excuse me, and Typer's actually built on top of Click. So it's not like they're competing, they're actually like, Typer very much wants Click to succeed, because it would be bad if they had to re-implement all that stuff. But what I noticed with your examples is that the type information that you have to specify for the arguments and all the options and stuff seem to be like custom namespace stuff. It was like
they are,
Google,
yeah, which is
string and stuff, and I thought that was curious.
It's definitely strange. Yeah, like click.bool. Yeah, it's a bit odd that I can't just put bool there.
Right, because in contrast, for those that aren't familiar with Typer, you do a lot of the same kind of stuff, but when you set your option, you would just write bool, because it's reading the type information from the type scheme that's available with optional typing in Python. So it feels very similar in the end. It just reads a little bit differently.
Mhm.
And part of that is click predated typer by a lot. So somebody had the advantage later on of saying, okay, now types are becoming more popular. Let's wrap this awesome click package in all this awesome type stuff and make more magic.
Yeah, the types definitely are supported, but yeah, they do kind of feel like an afterthought in that regard. And yeah, maybe that's just a product of when Click was developed versus all the sort of new age Python thinking about specifying types.
I think the newer versions of Click do support some of the basic built-in types instead. Like it just works out to be the same effect, but added handling for that. I'm curious, does typer, do you specify it with a syntax like this? Because one of my complaints is that you see kind of a lot of duplication. You specify debug appears in click.option and then it's the argument. And if you do add type hinting in the function, which a lot of us are going to have been doing, it's duplicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a good observation. So the short answer is no, you don't. You actually like in your function signature, so where there's like a click.option there. Now, Mike has a lot of stuff in his example, so it gets a little bit more complex as you're defining help text and you're defining other attributes. But you would say debug, and then there's some typer.option structure. I don't remember exactly what it is, and then within that is some keyword arguments. You define it one time, essentially, so you avoid what you're observing there with the click.bool and the bool, like that kind of stuff goes away.
Yeah, what I didn't do here is I put a default here, but I didn't actually put a default in my method signature. But in a lot of production code I do, which is duplicative, and I would rather not if I could avoid it.
Right. Yeah, typer would just eliminate the whole default and the option thing altogether. Just use it straight from the Python function and read that as it's like generating the CLI interface. So.
Yeah, Click has their documentation is fairly good, but they have a whole section. I don't think they actually, at least not in here, compare themselves to typer, but they definitely do compare themselves to argparse. They mentioned here they're based on optparse, which you mentioned you had worked with originally in sort of the early days of Python. We talk about a couple other tools here that I'm not too familiar with. Does anyone know this docOPT?
Yes.
Yeah.
docOPT, it's a pretty interesting idea. So there's actually like roughly a standard for what CLI interfaces should look like in POSIX. Maybe, I don't know if it goes full on operating system interface stuff, but a lot of commands, you look at them, they have a similar structure. And the idea behind docOPT is that you actually work backwards. You work from your help text, and then it transforms that help text into the parser that you need that's your code. So you define it one time in theory in your help text and get all of the code generated. So it's like sort of backwards from this. This is Click and typer, they're all in argparse, they're all code first, and you go out to the help text, and then docOPT is the reverse.
Yeah.
Have you tried it? It sounds like an interesting idea, but I also feel like it could be very difficult if you're like just writing a string and hoping that it works out.
Right, yeah, I've not personally tried it, so I can't speak too much to it. I did see it, I was like, oh, that's interesting, not my style, but I'm glad it works for somebody. And it's one of those things, it's like, if I had a little simple command that only had a few options, I'm like, well, okay, this is a great way to make a parser.
I feel like it's sort of documentation first, which is kind of nice. Makes it like very easy for somebody to look and understand how it works. But I guess that's also, you just need the help and do the same thing. So.
I guess it puts you closer to the user because you have to think through like what is the user going to see first, as opposed to what is the back-end code going to look like, and then how do I make that digestible to a user.
I think the big weakness that I would see in it is typing and like validation. like, because when you're at the user interface, unless somebody's gonna put, like, this is the type in your help, which is not something I conventionally see, I think you'd lose out on that. So that's probably like a gap. So again, if you have simple stuff that doesn't really care about types, it's probably great. But if you start getting complex and you need certain type information, I think that's where you're gonna run into trouble.
Yeah, and when I've written things with Click and I've had to build out some kind of complex object or a data class, I tend to make those things interactive as opposed to non-interactive with a whole bunch of command arguments, just because from a user's perspective, it can get a little messy. Or, based on, I kind of want to, walk the user through a workflow as opposed to just, give me everything up front and you have to know it all.
One thing that's really, I really like about Click is like file handling and directory handling. So you can specify like, okay, for this path, like it can be a directory, or it can be a file, or it can be one of them, or it has to be writable, or that is really nice. And then it really kind of encourages you to adhere to a Unix philosophy for your tools, so that everything can be composed and chained together and kind of follow that philosophy. It's good stuff.
Yeah, on that note, I haven't done enough with Click to know the answer to this. Does Click support like piped arguments? Like, can you pipe a file to a Click command line and have it stream it from there?
You could, if you specified an argument. I'm trying to think how that would parse. I suppose if you had an argument type, then it would be fairly easy to do. If you had one of these options, then maybe a little bit more difficult. It's not something I've tried too often. I'm usually piping things out rather than in, but I think you could do it. It basically just come down to basic Unix redirection at that point, and just making sure that you have that redirection correct, which itself can be a little bit challenging at times.
What I don't know is like, so some of the more advanced piping that I've seen is when you need like a null separator for stuff, and you're passing to XRs, and you're doing a bunch of stuff there. I don't know that that's built into Click. Maybe it is. I've not explored it, but I'd be curious as to what kinds of extra goodies are packed in there.
But definitely, like reading from standard in and like piping file in that way and reading it as an input, like, and you can totally specify like your default as standard in or a file path, otherwise.
Nice. Okay.
So, yeah, it's pretty sweet.
Are there any buffer issues? I know sometimes some tools will like choke on a buffer amount.
I'm not sure. I've done it with like piping in like a JSON model input that we have, and they would be on the order of a few megabytes, I guess. So,
Cool.
I thought I had some other text formatting, but there are a couple little formatting or style things built in, so you can have text that shows up in red or text that shows up in green. You can do fancier things than that, but that's generally all I've needed, is just to colorize some of those things.
I want to see the integration with Rich.
I noticed you use click.echo. What does that mean?
Click.echo is effectively the same as print, except that it will handle some special characters a bit differently than print will. There's some. It's one of their utility functions, and it supports their style argument too. They have a little bit here about. It's hard to read there, but it says it's basically the same as print, unless you're doing some things like you've got binary data in your output. So you could just as easily use print.
So that's where you get your red and stuff. Like,
Yeah. So for example, yes, you can use
okay.
click.style foreground green will turn your text green, for example.
Do you know if that's smart enough to detect terminals that don't support colors and like not print out the escape codes?
It's a good question. I think it's supposed to, but I haven't tried it. It says strip ANSI color code if the stream is not connected to a terminal.
Yeah, I think that's usually it's like a BMTT wire.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. One
Yep.
of the weird specifics of terminal handling.
You were talking about Typer. Is that also like a command line interface tool, or is that
Yeah. Well, Mike's bringing it up here.
is it essentially click plus some, or
Yes.
is it trying to do something else?
It's click plus some. It's written by the same gentleman who wrote Fast API. He also wrote like some kind of wrapper for SQL Alchemy that does type mixing with Idantic.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like Niantic is probably like
The only internal dependency is
He's
click.
not the author of Idantic itself, but he has found this like perfect niche of like let me bring in types and mix it with some cool package and get some benefit out of there. So it's pretty solid.
Stands on the shoulders of a giant. just one.
That's nice that its only dependency is click.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be my concern, adding yet another layer on top of that. That's cool.
And there's an example there, so you can see how it does.
So they have their own echo, looks like.
They have their own. I think it might just be an alias for the click. I think what it is they've wrapped up so where you would have click, the echo, and some of those common things, just so you're not having to import both typer and click. I think that's about it. But yeah, you can see it's generating all the same kind of help, and it just took it from the type signature. That's it's pretty cool.
So I guess their main thing is to try to be a more minimalist version of click, or click with less.
Yeah, just by taking advantage of that type of information, getting rid of just a few things that you'd otherwise have to type in there with your options and stuff. And I bet there's an example a little farther down that shows, like, there are ways to, like, add, how do you deal with help text? How do you deal with, like, on an option? Sometimes you have to specify a little bit more in your signature. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but it's pretty easy to do. Like you include this little extra thing from typer in the signature.
So is this what you were referring to when you were saying you only have to define it once? So it's
Right.
this parameter, for example, looks like it's defined once in the method signature and not up here again as a app.argument.
If you go down and look at the output, you can see that name.
I was looking to see
is
if
the argument to that hello command, and you didn't have to. Do anything. Yeah, it's great. So click has solved the base problem.
Yeah.
The typer's like the syntactic sugar on top.
I guess the good thing is if you're interested in typer and you're already using click, it's probably not too difficult to,
Right.
you could probably just do a search and replace for click in a bunch of places, replace it with typer and maybe a couple other changes.
Yeah,
And
that's cool.
yeah, that's cool.
Does anybody have any final questions for Mike? All right, thank you, Mike.
Cool. Thank you.